So I think with what we're doing with Microdosing Collective, this to me is that wedge where the initiative that we're pushing, the awareness that we're building, and eventually the policy that we will help to implement is going to be so important to ensuring that everyone has access to these medicines.
Welcome to the Multiverse, where we believe that mushrooms can actually save the world. Each week, we'll be meeting with thought leaders and experts to extract the best insights and stories across everything from functional fungi, psychedelic medicine, and so much more. Thanks for listening. Step into the multiverse with us. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Into the Multiverse. This conversation has been a long time coming. I'm so excited that I have Paul Austin sitting here on my couch today. First of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Alli.
So, Paul and I have been trying to schedule this interview for probably like 6 or 7 months or so. I'm really glad that this is the time that it's happened. Everything always happens at divine timing because we've been working on a lot of really interesting stuff together. And I want to talk about all of that. I have, a little intro that I want to give people for some context on who you are as a person. But, for anyone that is listening to this podcast that is in any way connected to the psychedelic space, they may have heard your name, they may have heard of Third Wave. You've created so much incredible stuff in the psychedelic space. A lot of people know you as the microdosing guy. And before we dive into all of that, I want to get into a little bit of your story. But for people listening, as far as like what to expect for this podcast, I'm sure you get these questions all the time. I always have people ask me, what to start microdosing with, where do they get their stuff from, so many like general stuff around microdosing. I send them a bunch of articles. I have a little kit together. I would like to in the future send them this podcast. So what I want it to serve as is really like a high level starter kit for anyone that's interested in microdosing across the board. So that's a little context.
I'll do my best.
You're the guy for it.
We'll see what happens.
So a little bit of background on Paul, and please fill in the gaps of anything that I miss, is you really are a leading voice in the psychedelic space. You're an entrepreneur. You talk a lot about personal growth. You're the founder of Third Wave, which is one of the most well-known psychedelic media platforms out there, specifically known for microdosing. You're also the author of a book, Microdosing Psychedelics. You're the author of a second book, which you're releasing shortly here. You've been featured in all of the major news publications, Business Insider, Forbes, Rolling Stone, et cetera, et cetera. So any gaps you want to fill there? Anything else you want to add to that intro?
In addition to a lot of the microdosing stuff, there's a lot of work that I have done in the higher dose space as well, including a retreat center in the Netherlands. And so although I've really focused on microdosing as an entry point into this, I really love looking at kind of the full purview of psychedelics and how we can work with them. I think microdosing is a phenomenal way to start with it, but a lot of the deep transformation does come from psilocybin, ayahuasca, 5-MeO, these other medicines as well.
Amazing. Okay, that's really good context. And I also think a lot of people are looking to get into the space via microdosing. Mm-hmm. At least a lot of the people I know that are resistant to psychedelic use will try microdosing and then start to explore those higher doses. So. Mm-hmm. Okay, amazing. Before we dive into like all the specifics around microdosing, because that's a whole rabbit hole, I do want to give people some context on more of who you are as a person. I love to look at people's LinkedIn profiles and fill the gaps around like how did they get from like internship at X, Y, and Z company that had no relevance. Yeah. And I watched the video on your website where it explains a little bit about your story, but basically where you came from is Western Massachusetts, correct? Michigan.
These are the M states.
One of the M states.
The Midwest.
Conservative, middle class, very standard traditional family. And you have, completely made this entire life for yourself in the psychedelics world. So like, just tell people a little bit about your story, like, maybe starting from high school version of you and like close the gaps.
High school version of Paul. I'm dating someone now who has a son in high school. And so when we're at dinner table each night, I'm kind of like, as he's going through high school himself, I'm reminded of those aspects and elements of who I was. So, 16, I tried cannabis for the first time. The family that I grew up in was, I would say, traditional, religious, by the book. Good and bad was often dictated by what was legal and not legal. And so smoking cannabis, my parents eventually found out it was like a huge, red flag. No, I can't believe you did that. Right. And yet when I had that experience, I thought it was profoundly funny and insightful and interesting. And so I continue to sort of dabble in that. And then the same friend who introduced me to cannabis at the age of 16, I did mushrooms with when I was 19. So in college and university. And that first mushroom experience, it was nostalgic in some ways. The sort of tactile senses and awareness that came to me were really interesting, but it wasn't like a profound life shift. I did acid about 5 months later, probably 250 mics, so 2.5 hits of acid. And that was really like the aha moment. And for me, the aha moment was always around, and always has been around, the sense of interbeing or interconnectedness. And that for me led to this phenomenal shift in basically like, oh, I grew up in this conventional way of being. I grew up in this conventional sort of family unit. I grew up in this conventional Midwest context. And that context, that setting doesn't necessarily determine and dictate who I will become. And so LSD was an opportunity to like really step into a full sense of freedom and become aware that I am the creator of my own existence and my own life, and that I can then choose what it is that I want to do. And so when I was 21, I moved to Turkey. I taught English there for a year. I got into digital nomadism and online businesses, started an online business for teaching English. And then in 2015 was living in Budapest. I was just noticing that more and more influencers like Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan were starting to talk about psychedelics. More research was coming out about psychedelics. Cannabis was happening with legalization. And I thought, I'm not really driven all that much as an entrepreneur, not that much by money itself, in terms of my ambitions aren't to necessarily make a ton of money, which some of my investors aren't necessarily the happiest about. What my real incentive is social impact and social change. And so I thought, with what's going on with psychedelics and being mindful of this meta crisis that we exist within, in terms of the climate crisis and the mental health crisis and the meaning crisis and all these sorts of things, I figured if I could pull one lever in that would really fundamentally shift how we perceive reality, it would be psychedelics. And so when I was 25, I essentially made it my mission to do everything that I could to ensure that psychedelics could become legal, accessible, and available, with a particular focus on education, because I feel like education for most people is that gap. We've been really conditioned to believe psychedelics are one thing, when in fact they are a completely other thing. And so I thought, hey, if I can bring something to the world, it would be bridging that gap for as many people as possible.
And when you came up with the idea for Third Wave, which also, can you explain a little bit like why it's called Third Wave? Because I also think that's really fascinating. Just talk about like why you decided to create that and what it actually has become today.
So this was on an acid trip in Budapest. I was with two friends. We had been on another probably 250 mics in the hills outside of Budapest. Talking
Seems
about
to be your sweet spot for breakthroughs.
Talking about the future of psychedelics, and a lot of creative processes are somewhat emergent. So when you're in the moment and you come up with a new idea, you can't often pinpoint why you came up with that idea. So it wasn't until like a couple weeks after the fact that I really started to understand how this name Third Wave of Psychedelics came about. And in undergrad and in college, I studied history, and I love history. I think history repeats itself, that we live in sort of this eternal recurrence, that there are different nuances to the way that time happens, but that time is not nearly as linear as we believe, that time is very circular. And so if history is always repeating itself, then what can we learn from the past that can be applied now to adapt and address some of the issues that came up, for example, in the 50s and 60s? So the first wave of psychedelics, indigenous use for thousands of years. So ayahuasca in the Amazon, the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, many other philosophers and thinkers used something called kykeon in the Eleusinian mysteries. Soma, which is talked about in the Upanishads and the Vedantas in ancient India, was used as a psychedelic substance. So there's this really rich and diverse ancient use of psychedelic plant medicines to connect to the divine, for lack of a better term. The second wave then was the counterculture of the 50s and 60s. And so what happened essentially in the 50s and 60s is LSD was invented in 1938 by Albert Hofmann. And LSD it's a semi-synthetic that comes from ergot. And ergot is a fungus that grows in rye bread. Ergot is the same thing that kykeon, which is the beverage that Plato and Aristotle drank. It's the same thing that kykeon is made from. And so LSD came back sort of into our consciousness, Western consciousness, I think, to reawaken us to this sense of interbeing. But unfortunately, it jumped from clinic to culture. Things went very sideways. And as we all know, there was a major crackdown on not only psychedelics, but basically all drugs that weren't tobacco, alcohol, and caffeine. And so the focus then of the third wave has always been, from my perspective, how do we take both these ancient practices, right, the rituals and the wisdom and sort of the earth wisdom that comes from these plant medicines, and how do we integrate it with cutting edge science and techniques and methodology that we've learned first in the 50s and 60s, and now that we have more and more access to. And so I really see it as like a both and an integration, and that will be required for what I call cultural integration of psychedelics, right? There's a big focus on medical, therapeutic, and clinical, but we had that in the 50s and 60s. I tell people we've been here before in many ways. The bigger leap, so to say, is really full, widespread legal access. And that's why in particular I focused on microdosing, and why in particular, even coming back to even some of the stuff that we're working on with the Microdosing Collective, why I feel like it's really important that we lead with that, because the vast majority of people don't want to necessarily lose their mind, for lack of a better term. They're much more comfortable first sort of going in the shallow end before they swim in the deep end of their consciousness.
That's such a helpful overview. And I like to think about and talk about a lot. If people understood the history of really anything, it would change the perspective of most things. And there's a lot of parallels between sexuality and psychedelics. If people actually understood like how sexuality has developed over time, and like all the classifications and labels, like if you trace back to, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, some of the same people that were also using, ergo-infused barley, whatever it was. And there's an amazing book called The Immortality Key that talks a lot about this concept that really blew my mind, because it's so well, it's a dense book, but it's very well done. Mm-hmm. And it explains the history of psychedelics really well from the Ulysses mysteries that you were referencing. So everyone check that out if you're interested more in learning about that. But if people just understood the three waves, it would change so much perspective. So I think the fact that even you titled your entire organization around this really, obviously you have to know what it means, but once you actually understand, it shifts people's perspective. Like how I got my mom to try psychedelics for the first time was explaining to her the history. And there's a sense of safety, right? Like a lot of these drugs that we feel so safe in from the Western medical system, they have not been generationally tested. Like they have been around for 3-4 decades sometimes. And a lot of people think that psychedelics were invented in the 60s. So I love that. Something I read on your website about third wave I wanted to share, because a lot of what you are talking about is psychedelic literacy. Mm-hmm. And I like the way that you describe this term, but you describe psychedelic literacy in large part as like a mission of the organization. So I want to read something that I read on the website. It's the mission of the third wave to facilitate psychedelic literacy within Western culture. If our society is to leverage the transformational potential of psychedelics, it must understand how to properly utilize them. Without a clear understanding of why psychedelics initiate us into new perspectives and the value these new perspectives bring, much of the current hype around psychedelics will go unrealized in the coming years. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and also what it means in your mind to be psychedelically literate.
Great question. So we were talking about this before we went live, and maybe you've heard me talk about it a few times, but the way I like to land this is kind of talking through the skill of psychedelics, right? And it's a helpful metaphor or helpful parallel, because when we think about cooking, when we think about writing, when we think about reading, back to literacy, when we think about jujitsu, when we think about playing an instrument, right? There's a certain level, there's like an acceptable threshold that most people are at. So most people hopefully can cook eggs or can make a sandwich or, can put a basic dinner together, right? And for that reason, they can feed themselves and they can have that. You then have some people who are Michelin-starred chefs, and who commit their entire lives to becoming an incredible artist through food. Right. And that would also apply to jujitsu. That would apply to people who play guitar. That would apply to anything that we consider a skill. And so when it comes to psychedelics, it's not that our entire cultural global population needs to become a master at working with psychedelics. It's simply that they need to know how to make scrambled eggs, for lack of a better metaphor. They need to know the basics. They need to know that these substances are not addictive. They need to know that psilocybin mushrooms, last for 6 hours compared to LSD, which might last for 12 hours. They should have a pretty good context and understanding of set and setting, that your mindset that you go into the situation matters and the setting in which you take them matters. Some of the history might be helpful as well to know that we've been using these for thousands and thousands of years, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when I look at psychedelic literacy, when I look at education, it's not that everyone has to read, War and Peace and Tolstoy, but they should be able to at least pick up a book, 100, 150, 200 page book, and go front cover to back cover and have a somewhat good understanding of what they just read. And so I think that applies to psychedelics. And then when it comes to psychedelics, then we have to look at, the way that I think about this skill of psychedelics is microdosing. So microdosing psilocybin, microdosing LSD, a sub-perceptible amount of a psychedelic that you take 2 or 3 times a week for maybe 30 or 60 days, right? So it's less so about the one time you take it and more so about the protocol, the sort of trajectory of that experience. The other thing outside of microdosing is higher doses. So drinking ayahuasca or doing, an IV of ketamine or doing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, right? These high doses are much more intense and powerful than microdoses. For that reason, some people would perceive them to be as more risky. And in some situations and cases, they are more risky. And because of that risk, right, with more risk comes greater reward, they often can be more transformational. So knowing that these high doses are useful and effective, if you have PTSD, MDMA is great. If you're struggling with depression, ketamine's great. If you're really looking to, improve creativity and innovation, maybe LSD is great. So just having a sense of, based on my intention, what is it that I want to use? And then the sort of substrate of all of that is these non-psychedelic modalities. So because psychedelics have been very sexy these last few years, there is an emphasis on the substance itself. And I think also because of American culture in particular, we're somewhat obsessed with pills. We're somewhat obsessed with taking something to have some sort of effect. But at the end of the day, we're working with these tools and these substances so that way back in quote unquote normal everyday life, we can just show up with more presence, with more compassion, with more happiness, with more joy. And the fundamentals of that is actually sleep, diet, exercise, having some sort of contemplative or meditative practice, right? These sort of non-psychedelic modalities, lifestyle practices that are fundamental to just living a good life. And so my sense is, again, it's not that we need 100% of people to be masters at psychedelics, but if the global population understands a few of these nuances at least, and if let's say 10% of these people can become quite skillful with how they work with them, then that's sort of the goal that I would say I'm aiming for, that we're collectively aiming for, is if we can shift 10% of people's perspective or consciousness, then that will be enough to really start to imagine what a new system and a new paradigm looks like that is not extractive, that is not toxic and poisonous, that is not sort of detrimental to human health, but that instead recognizes our interbeing and our interconnectedness and helps us to build systems that are based around that.
2 comments on what you just said that come to mind. I think that was, again, like a really helpful overview in what you just laid out, which so many people don't understand, myself included, when I was first starting to tap into any sort of substance, anything that altered my consciousnness. Is, most people enter the world of substances through caffeine and alcohol and then cannabis. For myself, I used to consume a lot of cannabis. It didn't really work with my system. I didn't actually love the way that it made me feel, but it was a very social thing. But I actually started to discount like any other substance because the way that cannabis made me feel. And, I like being altered. I like being sober. I really actually no longer like the way that alcohol makes me feel, which has been a really interesting progression because I used to consume a lot of it, especially like in college years. But a lot of people stop there. They consume alcohol, they try a little bit of cannabis, and then they kind of discount all drugs because alcohol feels like the safe safest one because it's legal. And what you said at the beginning of family, roundtable conversations is like what was viewed as good was what was viewed as legal, which is such a funny thing. If you understand anything about psychedelics and the legalization process of these substances. So that's thing number one, is like a lot of what I hope people get out of this conversation, if you are scared to explore these substances, is that the most legal ones have the highest toxic load on our system. And all of the ones that you laid out, LSD, psilocybin, can be so impactful. They're going to affect everyone's bodies differently. But I just think that's like a really important point to like touch on and emphasize. And then secondly is on the microdosing front, which I think is like a really good time for us to transition specifically to microdosing and dive in a little bit here, because actually we had someone on the podcast yesterday, Manoj Diaz, who's amazing. He's, an incredible meditation teacher, founder of Open, and his podcast will be out by the time this one is released. So people should go check that one out. But he talks about his most impactful psychedelic experience being with microdosing. And that's a really interesting thing, because we are in a society where more, for some reason, means better. Mm-hmm. And although you did say, yes, if you're taking, 3-4 grams of mushrooms, you're going to be catapulted to a different level of neuroplasticity, and you're going to, more likely experience some sort of an ego death, which can be super transformational. But why microdosing is more impactful, and the context of like how I want to pivot into this space, the reason why we, started this organization together, which we'll talk about in a second, is if you look at globally, all the problems the world is facing, I started to think about what is the highest impact that we can have. And oftentimes, like when you're slightly neuroplastic and you're in your life, which is what microdosing enables people to do, I want you to explain actually what's happening in the brain when you're microdosing, but you're with someone, like, I'm microdosing right now, you're with someone in conversation versus being like in an IMAS ceremonial space, like completely detached from your reality.
Correct.
And so it feels a little bit more impactful in that way and more approachable. So that's the context. I want to start just like giving people a really, you kind of define microdosing, but just start with, what is it, who should try it, and like we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, maybe so a little background and kind of how it came about.
Start with maybe the history of microdosing.
So I found out about it in 2015, March 2015. I was listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast. Dr. James Fadiman, who wrote the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, was on that podcast, and he had written a chapter in the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide about microdosing in particular. And I had sort of, when I heard that podcast, I remember back to my early acid days, taking 250 mics. And remember that for a week or two after those high dose experiences, I always had this like afterglow where I made better decisions about the food that I ate. I meditated more consistently. I was more open and connected to my friends in my social circle. I was more vulnerable. I had all that sort of negative self-talk and negative sort of internal chatter just sort of died away and dissipated. And then inevitably after 2 or 3 weeks, some, not all of those bad habits, if you will, would start to come back. And so when I heard about microdosing, I thought, interesting. This might be a way to elongate that afterglow. This might be a way to elongate that window of neuroplasticity, where it's not just take a high dose and then only for a week or two after, feel more connected, feel more disciplined, feel more whatever. It's take a high dose or just do microdosing itself and have that window of neuroplasticity that's open for much longer. And when I did microdosing, I had two initially. This was more than 7 years ago now, which is fucking insane. Two core intentions. One was more flow, right? To be more in a flow state, to have less resistance, less creative resistance when writing and, doing other sort of work. The second intention, which gets into your point about interpersonal and social ability, was to cut out alcohol and to overcome some social anxiety, to work through some social anxiety. Because I, like probably a lot of people who have listened to this or are listening to this, we so often use alcohol to mask social anxiety, or we use alcohol to be more outgoing and connected. And for that purpose and that reason, it's one of the oldest that we know, because we've been using it like for thousands of years for that. But it's also one of the worst because of what it does with hangovers and what it does to the brain and what it does to so many other things. So I found LSD in particular to be a lot more effective for that sociability, for that extroversion, for that outgoingness. The reason for that, to get into some of the particulars then around microdosing, let's just focus on LSD and psilocybin because those are the two most common things that people microdose with. One of the most common questions that I get is like, what are the differences between microdosing LSD and microdosing psilocybin? So LSD is a lysergamide. Psilocybin is a tryptamine. And what that means is, so there's kind of just to zoom back, there's three types of classic psychedelics. Tryptamines, so that's DMT, that's psilocybin, that's, there's a bunch of them. There's a lot of tryptamines. But DMT and psilocybin are the two best known ones. There's lysergamides, LSD is the best known lysergamides, and there's phenethylamines, which Wachuma is the best known phenethylamine. So lysergamides are more dopaminergic, meaning there's more dopamine that's produced compared to a tryptamine. And so the two main neurochemicals that are really being activated when we microdose and work with psychedelics generally are dopamine and serotonin. Psilocybin is more serotonergic, LSD is more dopaminergic. And so what that means is dopamine is tied to focus, attention, mood, extroversion. And so if you're someone who, you felt a little bit like you've been in a shell, maybe you've been in a more depressed state, maybe your energy levels haven't been as high as you would like them to be, or you're looking for more sort of focus, creativity, flow, LSD is a better substance to microdose with because of its impact on dopamine. Whereas with psilocybin, if you're someone who feels like you're too much in your head, if you're doing some somatic work, like internal work, if there are sort of sticky emotions that need to be worked through, or if you just purely prefer organics and plants compared to the semi-synthetics, then psilocybin can be a better substance for that. Psilocybin is not as intense because it is more serotonergic. Serotonin is tied to contentment and presence. So it's not as intense, and it only lasts for 6 hours. And so another thing that I tell folks is like, if you have a lot of anxiety, if you struggle with insomnia, do not microdose with LSD because that will likely exacerbate it. Instead, microdose with psilocybin. So I think that's helpful context on both of them. Now, in terms of two more things that I'll touch on. One is the amount to use with each one. So with psilocybin, you're looking at typically anywhere from 100 to 200 milligrams of psilocybin. What we tell folks is start low and go slow. You can always take more. You can't necessarily take less, right? So start with even 50 milligrams of psilocybin, try 100 milligrams, maybe go to 150, maybe 200, and just sort of feel into what's coming up, what your senses are, kind of what's going on for you. LSD, start at 5 micrograms. A typical microdose is more between 10 and 15 micrograms. And again, do a similar thing, 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe 25. And the reason I mention that is because we're so often trained in American culture to basically, like one size fits all. And what's really important with psychedelics is, 100 milligrams of psilocybin is probably going to affect you differently than it will affect me. And so when we're microdosing, we really have to calibrate our dose level to our specific needs. Some people who microdose, they love to feel it a little bit, which technically is not considered a microdose. I would call that a mini dose, but so it's slightly perceptible. So some people are going to do a little bit more, whereas other folks, they really love for it to be purely sub-perceptible. So calibration is really important when you're starting to work with microdosing, and that's just simply trial and error. Start low, go slow. The last thing that I'll talk about is neuroplasticity and the neuroplastic benefits. So as context for this, microdosing is fairly new. So there hasn't been a ton of clinical research yet that's been carried out on it. Some of the research says it works, it's effective, it's doing great things. Other research says it's placebo, it's really not doing much at all. And yet the anecdotes, there's a ton, probably hundreds of thousands of anecdotes at this point in time speaking to the power and potential of microdosing psychedelics. So there's a core mechanism of action that happens that when you microdose with both psilocybin and LSD, there's a precursor to neuroplasticity called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so what happens when you're microdosing with either psilocybin or LSD is it increases the production of BDNF, and that increased production in BDNF allows for a more neuroplastic state. Now, what matters a lot in this is neuroplasticity doesn't mean much if there's not willful participation. So unless you're willfully participating in your life, unless you're really taking agency, unless you're making new choices and decisions as a result of microdosing, then it's not guaranteed that much is going to change. So there really does need to be an interplay where, yes, you're microdosing. It's going to help with energy. It's going to help with mood. It's going to help with focus. And you still have to make that choice and that decision to commit to a meditation practice or to eat healthier or to spend more time outside or to be social, right? There has to be that intention still that's within it. So a lot of folks probably have heard about the role of intention with higher doses. Intention is just as important for microdosing. Mm. It's just not necessarily like when we think about higher doses, it's like the day of, I'm going into a journey. I have this beautiful space. I'm going to take a high dose, explore that intention. The intention for microdosing is much more like day 1 to day 30. So let's say you have a full month in front of you and you want to weave in one new habit. You want to start a meditation practice, right? Make that your intention, that I'd love to microdose to help me really commit to a consistent meditation practice every morning.
That's really helpful even for me. I've been microdosing for, several years really consistently and on and off, not as consistently, not as specific to a protocol, which I want to talk about protocols in a second because that's one of the most common things people ask about. But I have had times where I am more clear with my intention and I didn't really realize it before you said it. But when I'm a little bit more like laissez-faire about taking this without something behind it, I take it like I would another supplement, which I think is beautiful because I really view microdosing as a wellness supplement, hence the nonprofit we started to focus on this concept. But I think that not a lot of people do that. They take the pill and expect it to do all the work for them, as is, as the Western medical system has taught us. So that's a little bit of a change in behavior. So I think that part's really important.
Well, and just to say something to that, you've been doing this for so long, right? So a lot of people who are brand new to this, having that really clear intention going into that first protocol, I think is important. The way that I work with it now is it's much more intuitive. So if I just feel like, it'd be nice to have a microdose today for an energetic boost or because I'm on a podcast or whatever the reason is, I'll just take a certain amount that day because of that reason or that intention. So part of this is also dependent on like how familiar is someone with this, because us two, we kind of know this in and out. And even though you're not quote unquote necessarily setting an intention, there's probably some level of practice or presence that you're still bringing into that, where maybe you do breath work or you do ice or you do a morning meditation. So inevitably there's still some energy there that's still pointing towards whatever it might be.
Totally. No, I think that's, and honestly, like at this point when people ask me like, how do I microdose? Because I get a lot of those questions, I will, like hold the bottle of capsules and I'll be like, does my body want this that day? And actually microdosing has really helped me. One of the biggest things is with food and with things like meat or things that are a little bit more, diet specific. Like it helps me connect with whether I want to put that thing in my body because it helps me understand my own body and like just get in touch with it more. So like it really drops me into my body. And so now I've used that same practice like with the actual capsule. That's what I microdose with. I'm like, does my body want this a day? And it feels like a really clear yes or no, which I think is a kind of a cool progression because it wasn't like that at the beginning. I was very just like taking it on a protocol, doing it as I should. I do want to touch briefly on the protocol part. Like we don't need to spend too much time on it because it's, I feel like, pretty simple. What is the most common microdosing protocol that you recommend to people? So as far as taking?
Yeah, so there's 3 core ones. The James Fadiman protocol, right? 1 day on, 2 days off, 1 day on, 2 days off. Do that for 5 weeks. So 10 cycles in total. See how you feel. Take a couple week break and then assess where you want to go from there. That's the one that I started with. That's the one that I think a lot of people use. The reason he does that is because there is a 48-hour window of tolerance when we work with tryptamines and lysergamines and phenethylamines. And so allowing that sort of, even with a microdose, there's a slight afterglow. And then coming back to baseline on that day 3. And then again, so day 1 is the microdose, day 2 is the afterglow, day 3 is the baseline, and then day 4 is the microdose again. And so it just allows some spaciousness to really assess what's going on and how is this impacting me. Paul Stamets then has another protocol. I think initially it was 5 days on, 2 days off. Now it's 4 days on, 3 days off, 4 days straight, and then 3 days off. His intention behind that is more from a supplement perspective. How can psilocybin be combined with lion's mane and niacin to help with dendritic growth, to help with neuroplasticity, and taking it as a supplement with that intention. I think those are my recommendation for people who are new to this is to always start with the James Fadiman protocol. It allows for more spaciousness. One of my concerns with the Stamets protocol, at least for people who are new to this, is it could be too intense. Doing it 4 days in a row is a lot. And then the third protocol that I often talk about is sort of like the intuitive protocol, which is kind of what we've been discussing, right? If there's an intention that day that you want to explore, if there's a felt sense that it would be great to microdose on this day, then to go ahead and take a microdose on that day. I think that's more of a bit of an advanced solution. Once someone is familiar with psilocybin and how it feels, and maybe LSD, and I've started to microdose with Wachuma, San Pedro as well. And so I'm feeling into that in terms of how it impacts me. And right now what I'm doing is I'm doing the James Fadiman protocol. I mean, I've been doing this 7 years, but at the same time, because I'm starting with a new medicine, a new drug, Wachuma, San Pedro, I'm going back to basics, and I'm saying, okay, twice a week, I work with this, I take this amount, it's consistent, because whenever, this is more about personal growth or awareness or whatever, whenever we introduce a new variable, it could be cold plunge, it could be, vegetarianism, it could be whatever else, meditation. It's helpful to minimize variables. And so a lot of people ask, hey, it's my first time microdosing. Should I microdose with both psilocybin and LSD? And I'm like, no, right? Like, only do the psilocybin for now, see how that feels, see what your relationship is like with it, and then give it a little space, and then try LSD. I think it's also really important for people to develop that relationship, to know how it feels, to work with the substance, the drug, the medicine. Because again, as we talked about earlier, everyone is different. And so everyone is going to have a different capacity or tolerance for whichever substance they're working with.
Hi guys, taking a brief second away from the show to tell you a little bit about our sponsor, Supermush. Supermush is actually a brand that I co-founded. You may have heard us talking about Supermush and or functional mushrooms throughout the show, but long story short, functional mushrooms completely changed my life. I started using them as a part of my daily routine about 6 years ago. Everything about my vitality, my skin, my hair, my energy levels were on a completely new playing field that I had never experienced before. And we started Supermush to help other people get their daily dose of mushrooms back into their world, but in a way that was really easy and on the go and accessible and tasted good, because a lot of times mushrooms don't taste great. Supermush is actually the most effective way for you to get functional mushrooms into your system, because they're in the format of functional mushroom mouth sprays. We make 3 mouth sprays for energy, immunity, and chill. A lot of people don't know this, but mouth sprays actually have the fastest absorption rates. You will feel their effects almost immediately. I use all 3 of them every single day: energy in the morning, immunity in the afternoon, and chill every single night before I go to bed. If you would like to try Supermush, you can use code ITM15 at checkout. That's ITM15. This will give you 15% off your next order at supermush.com. We also make a whole line of really cool mushroom festival forward streetwear. And if you want to stay in the know for everything that we're up to as far as events, new product launches, you can join our text program by texting MUSH, MUSH, to 38048. So one of the also most common questions I get, and I'm sure you do as well, like, and you speak so beautifully to all the science and like the definition behind all of these substances, the dosing, all the stuff, right? And it's still illegal. Mm-hmm. Like, the legal landscape of psychedelics is very interesting. A lot of people call it gray market. It's very much black market. Like, it's everything that we're talking about. It's actually, we talked about this because we had a launch event for our nonprofit called the Microdosing Collective, which I want to tell people a little bit of the story behind. Mm-hmm. This is really good context for, but we're on a panel with a bunch of incredible people in LA at, a really amazing fancy hotel, speaking about the benefits of microdosing. We asked for a show of hands of who in the audience was currently microdosing or had before. Pretty much everyone's hands went up, and people in the United States are still going to jail for this. So it really is like such a place of privilege to be able to speak about this openly with really no fear around being imprisoned because of that. So that's kind of why we started this nonprofit. I want to talk about it, and like, mm-hmm. maybe you can start and kind of like share the story of why we started this, and we can we'll jam from there around it.
Do you want to talk at all about the legal kind of like
maybe
jurisdiction stuff, or maybe that can be weaved into
we'll go from like legal landscape, what's currently going on, and then how we started
Perfect.
started
Let's do that.
talking about Microdosing Collective, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, let's do that. So psilocybin is legal in 2 main jurisdictions, the Netherlands and Jamaica. Everywhere else, it's pretty much illegal. LSD, illegal everywhere, basically. And the reason for that is because in 1971, the UN passed like the some psychotropic act, because the United States had made psychedelics illegal in 1968 with Richard Nixon, the war on drugs. And because the United States had such hegemony at the UN, they basically forced every other country in the world to adopt their same policies, or else if they didn't adopt them, those countries would be eliminated or removed from any sort of US aid, right? So this is important context to understand. Now, what's happening now in the United States, and we'll just focus on the United States for now, because that's probably where most of the listeners are. There's 3 main tracks that are developing, converging, supporting, whatever you want to call it. One is FDA medicalization. So MDMA is slated to be approved for PTSD by 2024. Psilocybin approved for treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder by 2025. There are, MAPS is working on that. Compass Pathways is working on that. A number of other biotech-focused companies, drug development companies, are working on FDA approval. My sense is that will take much longer than everyone thinks, and that, in fact, state-by-state legalization and particularly decriminalization will significantly outpace FDA approval. And I'll provide some context as to why, and this will kind of get into the Microdosing Collective. Oregon legalized psilocybin. That will go into effect next year. The exact timing is still up in the air. It looks like mid-2023 is when that will finally go into effect. That is largely for higher doses in terms of it's a facilitated experience with a high dose of psilocybin. It's adult use, so you don't need a clinical indication to get access to it. Anyone can get access to it. However, you do need to work with a licensed facilitator in order to do it. Decriminalization, Denver, Oakland, Detroit, Seattle, San Francisco. There are a number of major cities now that have decriminalized psychedelics. That doesn't mean they're legal. It just means that they are the lowest priority for law enforcement. And so no longer can you go to jail for having possession of particular plant medicines.
And it's just
cities.
A fine. Like that's in theory,
it's just,
right? Like you would just
in
get
theory,
fined.
it's just a fine, right? And so now like Microdosing Collective and the why behind Microdosing Collective. So, the backstory is you and I and another friend, we were in the Butcher's Daughter having an epic milkshake. I forget the name of their milkshake, but it's the coffee one with, it's the best. And you were like, okay, I have this crazy idea. And I remember you saying, and I don't really want to like lead it. It'd be great if you could lead it. And I'm like, all right. And you're like, we should start a nonprofit to legalize microdosing supplements. And I'm like, I like where your head's at, Alli. And so we had that initial conversation, and it just like slowly we brought in, Josh Capel, we brought in John Downs, we now have this fantastic group chat that's going on.
It's like 60 plus people.
We have founding members for it. It's like, and what I've loved and respected about you, Alli, is you're like boss lady on it, like follow up, follow through. It's been really impressive just to work with you in that way and to witness that, especially for something that I think for me, this has always been so central and important to everything that I've personally wanted to do. And so it's really been fun to be like a collaborator with you in that, because no one is touching this, right? Like there is the focus on the decrim. There is the focus for high doses in particular with the state by state stuff. There's the FDA approval path, but it's high doses that most of the focus is on. And so, just to sort of reiterate what I mentioned before, the skill of psychedelics is not just higher doses. It's also these microdoses, these lower doses, what's also called psycholytic doses. And so if we really want people to become psychedelic literate, they can't just intellectually read a paper. It's actually best for them to experience the medicine themselves. And not everyone is going to want to do 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, but they will microdose. My dad, you mentioned your mom, my dad was the same way, right? Like never's been drunk, never smoked weed, church every day for 68 years now, pretty much, very by the book. And I got him to start microdosing as a result of some of the work that we did. And so what we landed on is this needs to be available. There certainly needs to be regulation involved, but you don't need to have a facilitator there present with you when you're microdosing. So all of the regulations so far that's been put into place for high doses is not relevant for microdosing because it's like comparing apples to oranges. It's just not the same. And so I think with what we're doing with Microdosing Collective, this to me is that wedge where the initiative that we're pushing, the awareness that we're building, and eventually the policy that we will help to implement is going to be so important to ensuring that everyone has access to these medicines. So I'm really pleased with how this has come about. I think it's going to take probably 3 to 4 to 5 years potentially. The one of the core concerns that I'll speak to around microdosing from some people in the field is, we're basically looking to legalize psychedelics for everyone. People in the psychedelic space don't want it to be as easy as going into a dispensary like cannabis and just buying it. And I agree with them. However, there is a way to create a system of sorts where those who want it can get access to it. The education is provided. And that way, like we can really, I just saw an article the other day about how there's I think an Adderall shortage now, right? I don't know if it's going to be Prozac or Zoloft next, but the fact is that these SSRIs and, the stimulants and a lot of these pharmaceutical medications are just ineffective, and they're addictive. And there's a ton of negative consequences and downstream of side effects. And microdosing has very few. And it just, as we all know, it just feels way better. So I am like so optimistic that probably by the end of this decade, that microdosing psychedelics will by and large replace SSRIs, SNRIs, and, ADHD medications more or less.
That was a really helpful overview. And also, likewise to everything you said. I mean, when I was first starting to think about this, it also, and I to help kind of give some color around like how I came into this space, because actually from a different angle, like I was a little more naive, a lot more naive than the angle you came at this from, which actually has proven to be very beneficial because I have, a fully legal functional mushroom company. The company's called Into the Multiverse. We do education events in the psychedelic space. We have a consumer brand called Supermush. And when we were first pitching this company, I was really passionate about microdosing. Hundreds of people around me were having their lives changed by it. Had some really like high level understanding of what was happening in psychedelic public policy, but was, pitching original investors on like, hey, we want to be the first psilocybin consumer brand or one of the first when it comes above ground. But just really like expecting that to happen. And then as I started to go to more conferences and like I was really like a student of the psychedelic space, listening to all the podcasts, reading all the books, like learning as much as I could, but I wasn't reading the policy. And then I started doing that. I started reading like Measure 109 out of Oregon and looking at the way that we're forming policy in the United States and Canada. And it's all around macrodosing at service centers. And so there's actually, in my mind, I was like, oh, wow. Like, first of all, a different pathway than I thought. I thought people were working on this. I thought there was 15, nonprofits focused on the future of psilocybin consumer products because I just assumed. And I didn't understand that there's actually some danger in the way that we're making policy currently. Like in theory, we're gridlocking ourselves. If you're just making policy around psilocybin as a substance, like you just pointed so clearly to, a microdose is very different. You can drive on a microdose. You're fully, normal, for lack of a better word. It's more about what you don't feel. And for me personally, if you're taking the correct dose than what you do. And, that's very different from 5 grams of psilocybin at a service center with a guided facilitated drip sitter. But we're making the policy like one sip of wine is the same thing as the whole bottle. And, there's a reason why we have over-the-counter limitations to certain prescription, to certain medications, and we have prescription at our higher dose. And in theory, that doesn't actually make any sense, right? Like, why are you, able to purchase a certain amount of a prescription medication over the counter, but at a higher dose, you have to have a prescription. And I don't know if I mess up the words on that, but point being, of course you can take 10 microdoses and it's a macrodose, or, 30, whatever it ends up being. But people are using microdosing at a rapid pace. It's growing exponentially. So many people, like we're in the center of it. We're in the Mecca, mushroom capital of the world over here. Within a 10-mile radius of where we're sitting right now, probably thousands of people are microdosing. Mm-hmm. and it's helping people so much. And we're in a point of privilege where we have access to really good quality stuff. But the other piece of context that I want to give to people that are listening to this and they're starting to explore this space is you have to be so careful where you're getting your, now it's brands, where you're getting your products from. It's all unregulated. It's all black market, underground, and there's a lot of risk in that. So as this movement grows, there is risk of cross-contamination between substances. 3 people in my friend circle have died because of fentanyl-laced ketamine over the last 12 months in Venice. And so that's because a lot of these facilities, as you scale anything and you don't have it regulated, there's a lot of damage that can happen. Someone that works closely with my team just took a microdosing product that was definitely laced with something. And there's a lot of risk in that. So on one hand, we're talking around access and human optimization, all of these things, but people are going to be microdosing anyways. And that's a large part of what we're talking about with the nonprofit is this is happening anyways. Let's make it safer. And what we did is we formed this nonprofit together with just some badasses in the space that have such a diverse perspective. We have the legal side, the clinical side, and we have these 6 committees identified across research and policy and funding and marketing. And the initiative's called the Microdosing Collective. It's a nonprofit. And the goal is to legalize microdosing as a wellness supplement, which is a really lofty ambition. Like you said, it could take years, but it's cool to see this group of people rallying around something that they really believe in, seeing companies that are now coming out of the psychedelic closet, founders of these companies, to support an initiative because microdosing has changed their life. And that's also kind of a core vessel I think that this organization can serve as. I know I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but if you're listening to this and you have a company or you work for a company where the founder or people on the team have had impactful experiences with microdosing, come support the initiative, because we want to help people come out of the psychedelic closet. That's a lot of what people do on this podcast in an elevated way, but actually support policy around it so that you're from Michigan. I'm from Missouri.
Get the Midwest.
Get the Midwest. Exactly. But get people that live between there. To have safe access to these supplements because their products are shipping all across the US and Canada. Some of these brands are even on Shopify. It's wild what's happening. So anyway, that's a little bit more context. And also I would love if you could speak a little bit more around the vision of what you think this organization will do or could do. I know that that's still very much it's a movement by the people. That's still in progress. We have an end goal vision, but how could this actually come to fruition?
With the Microdosing Collective.
Yeah.
So my sense is it will be on a state-by-state basis, maybe even with local governance, but I think state-by-state is really going to be the key indicator. And it's going to be best done in states that have already legalized. So, Oregon's already legalized psilocybin. Colorado is potentially, they're voting right now, going to legalize plant medicine. So I think it's key to get it weaved into states that have already done that. And then simply make it, it's probably some sort of you have to have a license on file. You might have to go through a bit of a questionnaire to assess that you are psychiatrically it's okay for you to work with this because there are a couple contraindications for working with this. And then, taxed and regulated. So there is a potential benefit and upside for the folks who are, working on policy to get it passed. I know our companies who are also working on FDA approval, but that's specifically for clinical and medical conditions. And my sense is with what's happening in Oregon and Colorado, that's for adult use of these medicines. And that really is the focus of the Microdosing Collective. It's we want it. We want a world in which anyone in any city in the United States, in Canada, in Europe can walk into a local pharmacy or they can walk into a local whatever it is. And they can say, hey, I'd like to have, my next 3-month supply of microdosing psilocybin. And I want that one that has canna and lion's mane and cordyceps because it's more optimal for X or Y or Z. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing I think to pinpoint or emphasize is the focus is on psilocybin. It's not necessarily on LSD. And what's fun about psilocybin is it can be combined with other herbs that also have potentially medicinal properties. And it can act as that amplifier of those herbs, which is what psychedelics are so great at.
And that's a lot of what, what we're doing with our it's a fully legal company. We have a fully legal functional mushroom company. One of the most common questions we get from Supermush, which is our supplement line, is, will this get me high? And it won't. But lion's mane is equally powerful. And so a lot of what I like to talk about, whether it's talking to partners or investors or anyone that's involved with the company, is, functional mushrooms are extremely powerful. And then when you combine psilocybin into that stack, it just amplifies and they work really beautifully together. There's a lot more of a rabbit hole we could go down with that, but that's for another time. A lot of the functional mushroom companies, and functional just basically means non-psychoactive, are setting the stage to then add psilocybin into their products in a very similar way to like how the CBD, and cannabis industry unfolded. But if you're looking to also get into the microdosing space and like still psilocybin feels unapproachable to you, start with lion's mane, start with cordyceps, start with a functional stack. Your brain will light up when you take a high dose of lion's mane. It has, increases neuroplasticity, and it increases REM sleep. It actually functions very similar in the brain to how psilocybin does. So that's something very important to note. That is fully legal, available at your grocery store. So try that first. And then if you want to start incorporating psilocybin into your routine, amazing. Something I do want to hit on, because I'm sure that's going to be like the most common question we get from this podcast, is like, great, I want to start, like, where do I get psilocybin? And I'm like, well, it's still fully illegal. Obviously, like, we have access to amazing products through friends that have black market companies. What do you say to people that ask you that question? And like, what are you, what is the legal answer of like how you respond to that?
So my legal team, they may or may not agree with no, I'm just kidding. So through Third Wave, we have a mushroom grow kit that we now sell, which is a kit that comes with everything you need to grow your own mushrooms besides the psilocybin spores, because that would be illegal to combine the psilocybin spores with the grow kit. So oftentimes one thing that I point to or discuss or talk about is, basically grow your own medicine, and you have that capacity to grow your own medicine, and let's help support you in making that as easy as possible.
But when people are like, oh, where do I get the spores? It's like, you have to figure that out on your own kind of thing. Or?
Well, so through Third Wave, and we can link to this in the show notes, we have, let's say, a comprehensive PDF, a guide called the Sourcing Guide, that walks through all of these steps and basically walks people through like psilocybin. Here's how you find spores. Here's potentially how you find a mushroom grow kit. There's a lot of what we could call psychedelic analogs that are available through Canada that people can purchase. And then the other core thing that I always emphasize is so much of this healing and so much of this medicine is about community. And so, you and I, like you said, we're in the epicenter of this. We're surrounded by it. We swim in it now. But a lot of people are really new to this. And so what I also encourage is for people to meet other people who are interested in the space. And so there's a lot of psychedelic societies that are popping up that are doing events. People go on Meetup, or, Meetup is the one that I usually go to. But if you just type Google Psychedelic Society in the closest big city to you, there's probably one that's there. And what I tell people is just go find the others, go meet other people who are interested in the space. And naturally, as you actually start to build relationships with people who have similar interests, then at some point, inevitably, you'll probably be able to find a substance. Mm-hmm. I can't wait till the day that we can sell it ourselves. But again, that's a big part of why we're doing Microdosing Collective together, is so that way there's some level of like, we want this to be the case. And so why not just take this on ourselves and make it happen?
Yeah, and it's been a really cool process, and we're super early in it. I knew nothing about public policy. Really was like unsexy, not really cool to me. Not something I ever thought I want to get involved in. And I joke about that all the time with Josh, who's doing all the legal work for Microdosing Collective and is one of our founding members and board members. But it's really cool to actually now having more of an understanding, like not nearly as deep as I want it, as I hope to go in this space, but that if you rally a group of people, you actually can change policy. And it's actually just like the corralling of the people. There's so many smart people that have the ability to get this over the finish line, but everyone's very much working in their silos. But it's been really cool to kind of just like stamp this as the mission, see people rallying around it, because it's something that's so deeply personal. People care so much about. Like, we're going to have, Shane from Mudwater, which is one of the fastest growing consumer brands in the United States. He's one of the founding members of our nonprofit. He's actually coming on the podcast in like an hour after you.
Oh, nice.
And he talks a lot about microdosing in the workplace. And so to see that normalization happen, and to see like leaders that are coming out and sharing like, hey, this is a huge part of my wellness routine. I think it's like in parallel, destigmatizing, educating, and then also really figuring out how we can plug that education and that community into the public policy space. So if you're listening to this and you're like, this sounds cool, I want to come be involved, like the more the merrier. We're doing a big event in Miami, as a sub sponsor partner with Third Wave in a week or so. So we'll have more events. And I think the call to action is anyone that's passionate about this, like, please come be involved, whether it's like just to volunteer or to be a founding member. And if you're interested in just like learning more about microdosing to start, look at Third Wave and listen to this podcast, which you're already doing.
And buy my new book. So I have a new book coming out.
Yeah.
It's called Mastering Microdosing. It's let's say an updated version of the one that you referenced in the intro, Microdosing Psychedelics. A lot has been changed and renovated, but that's coming out November 15th. So I don't know when this podcast is being published, but it could very well be out once this podcast is published. So go to Amazon.com, Mastering Microdosing. That's coming out. One other thing before we close is if there are any coaches or any practitioners who are listening to this, who are interested in working with psychedelics potentially, who are interested in working with psychedelics, we also have a 6-month training program where we train you in how to work with microdosing. We train you how to work with higher doses. We have like a dope 6-day retreat in Costa Rica that we do as part of it. And so you can, not only on Third Wave can you find information about microdosing and in the book, but we also have some other dope stuff for those who are more practitioner level people in this community.
Amazing. Well, my next question was going to be, what are you most excited about in the next 6 months and how we can support it? But you kind of answered that. Is there anything though, you obviously definitely check out the book. It's called Mastering Microdosing, which is like, I guess, volume 2 of Microdosing Psychedelics.
Correct.
Would you recommend people read them 1 and 2?
No, just read Mastering Microdosing. I'm taking down the other one.
This is kind of like the reformatted version with
exactly.
like new information.
Yeah. So check out Mastering Microdosing. I also have a podcast. We got to do a podcast at some point for Third Wave's podcast. We just rebranded as the Psychedelic Podcast, brought to you by Third Wave. So if you want to get even more into, I'm a little like, I do a lot of medical doctors, clinicians, coaches, talk a lot about the science. Those sorts of things are really present on the podcast. Folks can check that out. And then, just like we have a newsletter, stay in touch. If people are listening to this and, want to reach out to me, I'm on Instagram at PaulAustin3W, also on Twitter at PaulAustin3W. And I think that's about it.
So one of the things that I have a few more quick questions for you before we wrap up. I know your timer went off, which means you have to go, but we always like to end with kind of bringing it back to the personal. I know we like really dove into a lot of, like, you have so much knowledge in actually the protocols and the implementation of microdosing and how it can affect your life. But obviously you have like such a deep personal passion for this space and you feel it with all of your work. Like it's not easy work. It's super stigmatized. There's a lot of like critique out in the world. The psychedelic space is like beautiful, but also like very challenging. If you had to say, this is always the question that we end with because it is a podcast about psychedelics, but what is the most important lesson that you think psychedelics have ever taught you? And you can answer that whether it be microdosing or macrodosing. I'm sure there's many lessons, but what is one?
So there's this framing, a polarity of godhood and victimhood. And I think a lot of us are stuck in victimhood. A lot of us are conditioned to be stuck in victimhood, where we blame external circumstances, we blame things that are going on in the world, we give up our power to things outside of us. And I think the biggest thing that psychedelics have taught me is really recognizing and coming to terms with my godhood and the capacity for me to be incredibly powerful, to have incredible choice, to be fully responsible in my existence, as well as then to hold these softer elements of compassion, of listening, and of understanding.
And would you say that is like, does that mean confidence to you? Is it like, what does that actually like look like? Is it, the ability to think that you can create certain things that you normally would like have, imposter syndrome around, or like, what's an example of that?
It's a good question. The best example would be, I come back to like a fundamental belief that I now have is that I am the creative force in my own life. And that if I commit to something, and that if I envision it, and that if I stick with it and I continue to go and learn and grow and adapt, then I am capable of creating what it is that I wish to create. That could mean confidence. I think the biggest thing that I come down to is choice, that I have full choice all the time, that I am always responsible then for the choices that I am making. And that any type of blaming, which we all get stuck in it, any type of blaming is just giving up my power to something outside of me. And the more that I can take that back, take responsibility and take ownership, the more capacity that I have to create the existence, the life, the whatever that I want to create.
I love that. That's beautiful. I'm so glad we got to do this podcast. There's so many more questions that I didn't get to, so we'll have to do another one. I love getting to talk to you. I'm so excited about what we're creating. I'm so excited to hang in Miami next week. So if anyone's, this won't be out by Wonderland, but we'll both be at Wonderland in Miami. Paul will be speaking on a panel. I will be there to support that. And actually, wow, full circle. Probably a year ago in Wonderland, you had a
microdosing panel.
A microdosing panel, and I asked a question.
We planted a seed
question from the audience about the legalization of microdosing.
In front of like 1,000 people or something like that.
Yeah.
And now look at where we are.
So we'll record another podcast in a year and talk about the progress. And hopefully there'll be like some really amazing updates. Maybe what we'll do, I'm just going to put this out there so that we will remember to do it. Matrix, who is behind the scenes right now, remind me to do this, that like, in a year from now, the goal is that we will have an incredible community built around the Microdosing Collective. We'll have, let's just say, 100 plus founding members, a really significant movement, and it will be a force in the psychedelic space and actually pushing forward like real policy change to increase access to this sub-perceptual use of psychedelics. It's been so impactful for both of our lives. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Alli.
All right, more to come.
Thanks for diving into the multiverse with us. If you're interested in being a featured guest on the show, sponsorship, partnership, or you're just mushroom curious, we're always looking to expand our mycelium network. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Into the Multiverse, where you can find clips from this podcast, psychedelic legalization news, events that we're doing, and so much more. In addition, we've also created the world's first ever mushroom-specific marketplace called The Multiverse, which you can find on Instagram at Multiverse or online at yourmultiverse.com. We've also created our own in-house consumer lifestyle brand called Supermush. We make mushroom mouth sprays. We make a whole line of mushroom streetwear. You can find it on Instagram at Supermush or online at supermush.com. We'll see you next week. Much love.